Welcome back to the Saints series. Today I'm going to speak about one of the most fascinating saints in history, Saint Catherine of Siena. She was strong. She was a power in her time. She was the voice behind popes and politicians. She was a great healer, and mostly she was a lover of God. Saint Catherine was born in 1341, and she was the 24th of 25 children born to Giuseppe and Lapa. They had a business of dyeing cloth, and a very prosperous business. And Giuseppe was very kind and sweet, and he was very spiritual. The mother, Lapa, was loud, more materialistic. She was bossy, pushy. And Catherine, was about the sweetest little baby you'd want to see. Everyone loved her. They wanted to be with her. They would even borrow her, especially when they went to visit the sick, because she would cheer the sick person and everyone else up when someone was sick. She was a special child. She started having special visions. Her first one was when she was 6. She and her brother Stefano, who was 2 years older than her, were walking, coming back from their sister's house, who lived in the country. And as she was walking, she looked up at the church of San Domenico, and she saw Jesus on top of the campanile, the steeple. And she saw him sitting and surrounded by a few of the apostles. And she was totally mesmerized, and she stood perfectly still. Her brother didn't see anything, so he just continued walking. And then Jesus came down from where he was sitting, it was like a throne, came right close to her, and with 2 fingers, he made the sign of the cross. And she was totally transfixed. She was in another consciousness. Now her brother, when he realized that Catherine wasn't right behind him, he became scared for a minute. And he started calling, "Caterina, Caterina!" But she didn't hear a thing. She was in a whole another world in God. "Caterina, Caterina!" He didn't hear her. So he ran back and continued while he was yelling, and then he started grabbing at her sleeve and shaking her, and then finally she came back down to earth. And when she looked back up, because she didn't want to lose this vision, the vision was gone. But it changed her life. When she came back home, she was different. She didn't tell her parents her spiritual experiences. She didn't tell anyone about these things for years. But there were certain things her mother noted in retrospect that made her think there's something different about her. One of them is when she was in a hurry and she wanted to get to the top floor. Usually one walks, and touches the steps. Caterina didn't do this. She would levitate if she was in a hurry to get to the top step. And she probably didn't even realize it. She was only 6 years old. And the mother didn't want to know it. It scared her. So she just didn't say anything or didn't tell anybody when she witnessed things like this. Also, Catherine started changing the type of games she played. Instead of playing house and playing mother and wife, like a lot of little girls do, she started playing hermit. She started playing saint, which isn't that uncommon, but she just really changed into this automatically. But when she was alone, she found a little cave underneath the stairs, and she would stay and she would fast, try to skip meals, so that she would do this for the love of God, a sacrifice for God. And she even started at this point, and this was a little bit young to do this, flagellate herself. She had a cord with knots on it, which she used to use. Now, this was a common thing for the religious, people in the religious orders, or people that were, they wanted to feel God's presence, they wanted to give something to God, and this is the way they did it. They thought, Jesus suffered, let's suffer for Jesus. So it wasn't an uncommon practice, but at 6 years old it was a bit. And she relished it. And so these are the kind of games she used to play. But her mother didn't know much of this. She kind of kept this kind of thing secret, especially her vision. She didn't say anything about that. But now, at the age of 12, her father and her brother started looking for a husband for her, a suitable husband. But she didn't want it. She didn't want anything to do with marriage. She felt that she had already taken a vow of virginity many years before, 6 years before, with Christ when she had that vision. So she wanted no other husband but Christ. But her parents couldn't understand what happened. Why don't you want to participate in our family by doing what every young girl does? And so it was a little bit of a battle with her and her mother. Her mother tried to convince her. She tried to pretend, but she didn't feel it in her heart. And finally, she confided to someone in the house. It was a priest. His name was Tommaso. And he had been living in the family home for some years. He was her cousin. And she confided in him. And he said, well, the only solution I could think would be for you to cut your hair. And this will show your parents what you really want. And this is exactly what she did. But her parents did not take it well at all. When they saw the spectacle of her having short hair, they were totally aghast. And they decided to punish her, and punish her big, until she came to her senses and was willing to be normal and get married like everybody else. And so she said, okay, I'll accept whatever punishment you give me. So the family fired the maid, and she became the maid for the family. The mother said, well, if you won't serve a husband, you'll serve the family. So she had to make all the beds, she had to cook, she had to clean, and she was busy a lot. The family took away her room, so she just had to find a little spot here and there to be alone. But what she did instead, she created what she called the cell of self-knowledge, because she didn't have any room to be by herself where Jesus could come to her. So in this cell, we all know what this cell is. It's the cell of meditation, where there's no distractions, and there's only she and God. So she lived in this cell as much as she could, and she did her work, and she did her work lovingly. She started a fantasy that her family was the Holy Family, and her father was Saint Joseph, her mother was Mary, her brothers were the apostles, her sisters and her sister-in-laws were holy women in the Bible, Mary Magdalene, Martha, and so on and so forth. So she was able to feel God's presence in everything she did. And she worked well and she worked hard and she didn't complain. And she did it with all her heart, thinking of God and thanking God for this wonderful experience he was giving her. After about a year, though, her father passed by her room and he saw her standing probably in the cell of self-knowledge where she was surrounded by light. And he even said later that he saw a dove flittering above her head and light emanating from her. And he was totally in awe of this presence and who his daughter was. And he thought, after this experience, his anger toward his daughter left. And he realized, this is what God wants for my daughter. And so he ordered the family, he called the family together, and he ordered the family, leave her alone, let her live exactly the way she wants to live. She is living in God. And so he offered her a room. She could have had any room in the house, but instead she took a little cell that was near the kitchen. She put some boards in it, so she would sleep on the boards, and she hung up her little cords, which she would flagellate herself regularly. And also, the family, she wouldn't see her family. They would bring food and leave it in front of her little, she called it her cell, her little room. But again, I want to emphasize, it wasn't abnormal for people to do these things. All the orders did this, and even single religious that lived at home did this. There are only a few people that protested against this after a while. One of them was Saint Francis. After he already abused his body quite a bit with flagellation and with fasting, he realized it's not the best thing. He had brothers around him that were trying to follow in his footsteps, and he realized they're weak, they're tired. And he told them no. He said, do what you can. If you feel to fast, fast. But if your body's hungry and you can't do your work, please eat. And the more important thing is that you can work for God. If you're sick and weak and tired, you can't give your all to God. And then another person that used to also get into this activity was St. Clare. And she wanted to fast. She was already eating a very simple meal. She wanted to fast and started doing it 3 days a week, complete fast. He told her no. He gave her a formula of how much food she had to eat minimum every day, because he said she was more important live than she was dead. So there were changes. There were people that thought like that in the religious orders, but it wasn't that widespread. And Saint Dominic also was the dominant saint in Siena at the time. Remember, it was the Church of San Dominic where she saw Jesus, but they were the biggest presence of an order. And Saint Dominic, who was a contemporary with Saint Francis, he loved flagellation. He would talk, oh, we've got to fast, we've got to give everything, we have to suffer. It was one of his things. So he was the dominant, energy. And so it was considered really perfectly okay. And so this is what she did. She was not depressed. She was always full of joy. She was full of God. She was also full of energy. But she wanted to give herself in such a way that would bring her closer to God. This is how she looked at it. But she was not sick. She was healthy, well, and full of life and full of God. And so, but one day, something happened. So this was her life. She lived in this cell. She had lots of visions of Jesus. And she had visions that seemed pretty outrageous, but they were her visions. It was how she touched God and how God touched her. She had one where he gave her an engagement ring. Then she had another one where he wed her, and Mary was with them at the time. And she had all these incredible visions, but each of these visions brought her more intimate with Jesus. And she thought she could live her life like this. Fasting, flagellation, having visions, loving God, and being in his joy all the time. But it was not to be. Jesus came to her and he said, look, there are 2 commandments. One is to love God with all your heart, your mind, and your soul. And the second one is to love your neighbor as yourself. I'm telling you this because I have a great work for you to do. I want you to go out in the public and start teaching and preaching and doing my work. And she was totally aghast. She said, oh, how could that be? She said, I'm a woman. We don't do this kind of thing. Women have children, they serve men. How is this possible? But he said, remember when you were a child and you would imagine that you were like St. Dominic that would go out and preach to people, teach them and debate and to help bring peace in this way? She said, yes, but I was a child and it was a fantasy. He said, no. He said some remarkable things to her. And let me read to you some of the things that he said. In my eyes, Catherine, there is neither male or female, rich or poor, but all are equal, for I can do all things with equal ease. I spread abroad the grace of my spirit where I will. And I will raise up women, frail by nature, but endowed with great strength and divine wisdom. Therefore be brave and obedient when I send you out among people. Wherever you go, I will not forsake you. I will be with you, as is my custom, and I will guide you in all that you do. So he asked her to leave the security of her cell, to be again with her family. So now she's using her cell only as a place to rest, but she's taking her meals with her family. It was a little difficult at first. They hadn't seen her maybe in a couple of years, and they made fun of her at first. But she was very strong. She knew she was doing this for God. She knew how to love them. She loved them from the beginning. From her birth, she loved everyone. But she felt, when she found Jesus, that she needed to ignore them and put her family and people aside so she could dedicate all her love to God. But now, she knows now that Jesus is telling her, that's not the way it is. You need to love others in order to love me. And so it was so easy for her to open her heart because she already had this in her. So she started being really kind. She served them. She washed the dishes, which she was already real experienced by now at that. And helped them. If they were sick, she would cure them. If one of the maids or servants were sick, She would take over their duties for them, but she was always so kind. And now she had a dream, which St. Dominic came to her, and he gave her a habit to wear. So she knew it would be true, and she realized this is what I need to do. And so she tried to join the Dominicans. Not in a monastery, but as what's called a mantellite, or a tertiary, someone that was a lay sister, but they wore a habit. And they said, absolutely no. You're too young, you're too beautiful, and this is not the kind of work for you. All of the other women that were mantellites were women of middle-aged, women that were widows. And they gave their whole life to God in service. And they thought this would create a scandal, a young, beautiful woman in the situation. But instead, she prayed. She said, what can I do so they'll accept me? And then she became sick. And it seems like it was the smallpox, because she had a high fever. She broke out into blisters. And then at the end of the fever, she had enough pockmarks on her body, especially her face, which kept her from being marriageable. So they accepted her. And she was only 14 years old. And they accepted her in the order between 14 and 15. And so she immediately got to work helping the sick and the dying in Santa Maria della Scala, which was a pilgrimage place and hospital in Siena. And they loved her. She helped them die. She started seeing this as a mission to help people find God at the end of their life, because she was able to see the condition of their souls. And they saw where they went wrong and how they could correct themselves. And she was not one of these people that believed in hell and damnation. She believed if you open your heart up to God and receive Him, you will be in God. So she would try to give them that vision of what will happen when they actually leave their body, that they will be with their sposo, they'll be with their husband, Christ, in paradise. And so they changed. They started correcting things in their life. They started lifting up the sadness and the depression, and they started feeling God's presence within. And when they died, they would hold Jesus' hand and become Jesus' wife or Jesus' husband. And it was a beautiful thing to think that way. Of course, she had enemies. She had some other mantellates that were jealous of her. They told lies about her. Certainly people from outside didn't understand what was going on. But she had so much light around her that she started getting many followers. People started wanting to be beside her because of this. Another area where Saint Catherine worked very well was with prisoners. The laws were very strict. There were people that were beheaded just because they said something wrong or made a mistake and insulted the wrong person. And many of these people were very angry and very upset, and they were angry at God for their situation. Well, she would meet with them. She would hold up the mirror so they could see the state of their soul as well as she. And she would show them what it would be like in the next life if they opened up their heart to God. And so she would walk along with them to the guillotine, and she would pray for them. And these people would say, "Oh, Jesus, oh, Catherine, Oh, Catherine, Jesus was often the last words of these people being guillotined. And then she would see the vision of them going up to the Lord in heaven. And it was more often than not, these people changed their lives. So she felt this is a mission of mine. But God wanted her to do a whole lot more than that. But first, another thing, she would go to the church to take communion. Now, in those days, they didn't give communion every day. Once in a while, once a week if you were lucky. And she always wanted communion. And she would moan if she didn't get her way. And she would go into swoons and she would faint. And then she would go into big ecstasies. And by now she had a lot of followers. And these women especially would hold her up so that she wouldn't fall to the floor as she was having her ecstasies. The church authorities sometimes got impatient with her. They wanted to close. And they would sometimes just carry her out and put her out on the street while she was in an ecstasy. But then when she was out of her ecstasy, the women would bring her home with them and would be in her presence. But it was more and more people were seeing that this woman lived in another consciousness. She was kind. She was good. She was down to earth at the same time, but when she was in ecstasy, she was in bliss. And it rubbed off on the other people that followed her. Now she entered into the world of men, which was unheard of at the time, but she knew what Jesus wanted of her, so she went and did it. She was not what you would call a feminist. They didn't exist in those days. It was further from her thoughts to be like that. But she was doing what God was telling her to do, make a change in the world. Saint Catherine, she fought corruption. There were many religious people living immoral lives, from priests way up to the Pope in the church. It was normal for them to live corrupt lives, many of them, not maybe all. And often she didn't have to search for them because they were everywhere. Sometimes they even found her. They searched for her. And this is the case with two religious that wanted to bait her. They wanted to shame her. They wanted to make her feel bad, and they wanted to make her look like a fool in front of her disciples. So they decided to pay her a visit. One of them was a Franciscan by the name of Brother Gabriel of Volterra. And he was a scholar who taught sacred theology, and he also was the head of the friar minors in his sector. And he had a mistress, and he lived in luxury in a beautiful home. And his friend was an Augustinian prior, and he also was very rich, and they didn't want to give up their riches. And they found a lot of fault in Catherine. They thought, what stature is this woman to be telling us how to live? She's just a woman. She's not educated. Who taught her theology? So let's straighten this out. So they went to her house. But before they could knock on the door, St. Catherine knew who they were. And at the time she was talking and giving lessons to her disciples. And she stopped. And she started praying fervently. And after a few minutes, she opened her eyes and she smiled. And she said, "We're about to catch 2 fishes in a net." And the disciples weren't sure exactly what she's talking about. And she never got to explain because these 2 brothers had entered the house by now. She gave them a comfortable place to stay. and introduced herself. And they started speaking right away. They had a lot of questions to ask, and they shot it to her very, very quickly and very coldly. And when both of them were done with their lingual abuse, she calmly responded to them. She said, "How can you pretend to know anything about the spiritual kingdom? You who live only for wealth and fame." And she looked at the Franciscan and said, "How can a son of St. Francis dare to live the way you do, with a mistress, with all this wealth surrounding you?" And this man was in shock. How did she know this about me? How did she know? And from that moment, he changed. He fell on the floor, bowed down in front of Catherine, and he said, "I'm so sorry. I'm going to change my life." And he did. He ended up giving up his apartment, giving up his mistress, and he joined a smaller friary in which he was just a humble brother instead of the head of the order. And he served these brothers, these Franciscan brothers, for the rest of his life as a servant. Now, the other one also was deeply affected. He went home and decided also to sell everything, and then he returned to follow Saint Catherine, and he followed her for the rest of her days. He followed her to Avignon to visit the Pope. He took down dictation, but he was always with her whenever he could. So this is how she worked with people. They called this "be Catherined," when they changed completely and they became who they really were in their spirit. She was like a mirror for people. She held up a mirror so they could see what they were doing where they couldn't see it before. But always with love, always with joy, always to help them. That was the purpose. Not to criticize anybody, but to turn them around and change. And she was in bliss when they did. And that's what she considered her main mission. So she got a lot of male followers as well as female followers. Now the females, she treated them as peers. They would bake bread together, they would cook together, they would heal each other. She would talk about Jesus and tell them stories, and there was a camaraderie of joy and bliss among them. With the men, it was a little different. She became their teacher. She treated them like they were students. And it was a whole different feeling. And they accepted it completely. Even some of the religious that were appointed as her confessors. The Dominican order provided her with several confessors during her life. The most famous was Raimondo di Capua, Raymond, who she grew to love dearly. And he was a good choice because he was very intelligent, a theologian, but he knew right away after meeting her, she's not to learn from me. It's me that's going to learn from her. He could see who she was. And so he followed her, became her confessor legally, but he became her student. And most of the men that followed her became She dictated and they wrote, because she was now writing a book called The Dialogue. She was also writing letters. She wrote letters to kings. She wrote letters to queens. She wrote letters to the popes, trying to get them to change their ways. Often they wanted to meet her. She would travel a lot. She would travel to Pisa. She would travel to Florence and meet with different opposing families. So, to try to create peace and harmony. And she was successful in almost every case in this. She was brilliant. And they wondered, how could this woman be so brilliant? How could we feel God's presence when she's in our presence? And so she continued on like this. There was one point when she went to Pisa and she was praying in front of the crucifix there, and she received the stigmata. And as she started feeling it happening, she knew what was going on. And she said, oh, please, my Lord, I don't want anyone to be able to see this. I want it to be invisible so no one knows what is happening. And so she was granted that wish. And she received the stigmata and all in her side and on her hands and on her feet, which gave her pain for the rest of her life. She didn't have to flagellate herself anymore because she was in continual pain from the stigmata. And at that point, she stopped eating. And she didn't eat for 9 years of her life. She only drank water and the Eucharist. Her body was weak and she didn't have so much energy anymore. But I think it was mostly from the pain of the stigmata. So anyway, she kept on dictating. And she would dictate sometimes when she was in ecstasy. She would pray, she would dictate some more, she would pray again, she would go in ecstasy, and people around her would just be in that presence with her. She had one follower who was called Stefano, that was quite well loved by people. But he was torn between the spiritual life and a worldly life. And his name was, I think, Stefano di Monico. And this is what he said about her. He wanted to be with her always. Her whole life was a miracle. But there was one circumstance about it truly admirable. Nothing she did, said, or heard hindered her soul from being intimately united with God and plunged, as it were, into the divinity. And he was a person that wrote about his spiritual and mental anguish and trying to decide, do I want God completely? Do I want to still hold on to the world? But then he wrote that he found peace only in Catherine's presence, where the power of the Spirit within her made the attractions of this world seem as if nothing to him. But when he was separated from her, he was thrown into spiritual agony. And at the end, he chose to be with God all the way. And this is how she affected people. This is how she affected the popes. This is how she affected politicians. Now, the papacy had moved to Avignon 68 years before, and because of the difficulties and the corruption that was going on in Rome and the unreligious feelings that were happening in Italy at the time, the life of the Pope was being threatened. And so the King of France invited the Pope to go to Avignon and live in his palaces there. And that's what they did. But the papacy went from bad to even worse because there was more corruption in Avignon, more temptations. And so she thought the first thing we have to do is move him out of France and back into Rome, the holy city. People have tried before, but they didn't succeed. So she went right up to the Pope and asked for an interview. He loved her. He saw again what he was doing and the state of his soul. And he felt what she was saying is right. She had to stay there 6 months to truly make him leave. But at the end, he said, okay. She told him, stand up and be a man. Instead of being insulted, he stood up and became more of a man and stood up against these corrupt people that wanted to keep him and the papacy and the power of the church in their country. So she persuaded him to leave, and he did leave, but he only lived about a year and a half. And so he didn't accomplish a whole lot except moving from Rome, from France to Rome. She loved him dearly. She called him Dolce Babu, which means sweet father. And one thing, she was not against the church. She was not anti-church. She was very much pro-church. She didn't mind the hierarchy. She didn't mind them setting rules. She didn't have a problem. What she had a problem was with the corruption in the church. She saw the church in a whole different way as being a continuation of the life of Jesus Christ. It's a place that can serve mankind, help the poor, heal the sick, spread light and joy among mankind. This is how she saw that the church should be. She didn't see them as a material institution, but this is what it became, and this is what it was. She was trying to get it back to what Jesus would have wanted it to be. And so she had resistance from the cardinals, the bishops, and all the prelates in the church. Gregory XI was weak, but he was not a bad man. He had morals. The next pope was actually very weak on his morals. He listened to Catherine when she was in his presence. But when she was out of his presence, he listened to all his corrupt cronies. And he was very much disliked by the people. But she prayed for him, and she told people to support him anyway. And she tried to get him to do good things. It was very hard for this one. He loved her. He felt good in her presence. He felt holy in her presence, like everyone else did. But when she wasn't there, he was totally lost. And so it was a struggle for her. And it even caused something called the Great Schism in the church. After him, or during his papacy, the church started splitting up. They had a pope in France and also a pope in Rome. Anyway, she was starting to feel, it's time for me to die soon. And so she wanted to go back to Siena for her death, which she was very happy to be again in the arms of only God. But the Pope wouldn't let her go. He wanted her there for every single minute of her life because her presence to him meant a lot. His soul knew, even though he wasn't able to abide by the goodness and the love that she wanted to teach him. So he demanded that she stay, and she stayed. And when she died, she was buried in the cemetery in Rome. And miracles continued happening. She was always very good on miracles. She used to heal people when the plague came around. She would say, "Get up. What are you doing sick?" And they would get up and start working again. So she was a great healer, and people knew this. And so after she died, the healings continued for a long time. But people started battling for her body. They said, hey, we should have her body in Siena. Somebody else wanted her body in Pisa. This is where she received the stigmata. We want her body. Rome, of course, wanted her body, of course. And so about a year afterwards, with the insistence of several cities, they decided to cut her up. Her head and one of her fingers went to Siena and is in a beautiful reliquary there. One foot went to Venice, another foot Pisa, and different fingers and different parts of her body went to different places. They all wanted a part of Catherine because all of Italy had experienced the grace of Catherine. The major part of her body was kept in Siena. No, was kept in Rome. The Pope insisted upon it. And she's buried. Now there's a shrine with her body in the church of Santa Maria Sopra, Minerva. And this is a wonderful place to visit. But Catherine created a lot of questions in people. And many books have been written about the life of Saint Catherine. How did she heal people? She was a healer. How did she learn how to read and write when she wasn't educated in it? She said that Jesus taught her how. And she did. She learned how to read. She could read a whole book in a minute and then say what she wrote. How was she such a theologian, her being a woman and didn't have the education? Who was this person? What is this invisible wedding ring? What is this invisible stigmata? I mean, how could this be real? And so many books have been written kind of doubting who she was. How could she live for 9 years without eating a thing? How could this be? She must have snuck food. Maybe she was an anorexic. Many modern books will say she was a holy anorexic and she had problems with food. And so all these books have been written and many people say many things. But she was a miracle. She was a miracle herself. And the real miracle of Saint Catherine was the depth of her love. The depth of her love that flowed between her and God continually from the time of her first vision. The flow of her love that flowed to people that she met. The flow of her love that was bright and great, that changed people's lives. This was her miracle. Some people actually said she was a failure because she didn't finish ending the corruption in the church. She did bits here and there, but she didn't finish it. For her, it was a miracle. She felt she had completed what God sent her out to do. On her deathbed, one of the things she said was, "Thanks to the Most High, to the Eternal, who placed us like knights on a battlefield to combat for his spouse. Protected by the shield of holy faith, the field is won and the victory is ours." She's saying the importance is how we fight the battle, the love that we give, and our willingness to serve God. This was Saint Catherine. She certainly did that. And she showed us that we need to be a warrior for what God wants us to do and fight the battle of life. This is who she was. And she was great. Saint Catherine of Siena, the Great. Close your eyes a minute and feel this greatness. The greatness that we all have within us. Feel God within us and what He wants us to do to help others. Open our hearts and do this every day. Have this visualization of God flowing through us and making channels of us for His love and for His divine grace. Think of Catherine and what she did, the bravery and the courage. We can do that too. We can be channels for the divine. See you next time with another story of another great saint.